Boa tarde a todos, a todas, ou bom dia ou boa noite, dependendo dos vossos fusos horários. Bem-vindos ao primeiro dia da segunda semana da 12ª edição da Academia sobre Economia Social e Solidária. Eu sou a Juliana Maziero, aqui do CIF de Turim, e vou ser a facilitadora desse painel. Primeiro, bem-vindos de volta, é muito bom tê-los conosco nessa segunda semana. Temos muitas plenárias interessantes e outro set de eletivas para recebê-los todos. Começo essa apresentação pedindo desculpas por sexta-feira. Sei que tivemos alguns problemas com a Feira de Conhecimentos. Não se preocupem, essa semana vamos ter outro espaço para que possam compartilhar. Aqueles que não conseguiram escutar ou compartilhar as experiências na sexta-feira, nós iremos realizar outra vez essa semana, ok? Vamos passar mais informações ao longo da semana a vocês, para que possam fazer a partilha das suas experiências também, ok? Hoje estamos aqui juntos para fazer uma plenária sobre mecanismos de financiamento inovativos para a economia social e solidária. Eu gostaria, então, de apresentar o nosso moderador, Churchill, que é chefe do Departamento de Finanças Sociais da OIT. Então, Craig, por favor, a moderação é toda tua. Obrigado e que tenha uma boa plenária.
Excellent. Thanks, Juliana. So welcome, everyone. My name is Craig Churchill, and I work at the International Labour Organization in the Social Finance Program, where we look at how the financial sector can contribute to the ILO's decent work agenda, including achieving social justice. So this is a great opportunity, a nice synergy to look at a topic that's near and dear to our heart, to try to grapple in more detail with how social solidarity enterprises are able to access funding, what funding they need and how they access it. And we've got a really strong lineup for you today. We'll just start with the plenary, the introductory remarks. And for that, I'd like to introduce Gianluca Salvatori, who's the Secretary General of EURICSE. So Gianluca, over to you.
Hi, Craig. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you to you all for listening to me. I'm going to share my screen. Can you tell me if you can see the screen? Is it okay? Okay. Well, thank you. My name is Gianluca Salvatori, working in a research center based in Italy, in Trento, working on social economy since 10, 12 years. My presentation will be about finance for social and solidarity economy. And first of all, let me point out why we are discussing this concept. In the last years, I would say across the two main crises that we went through, so the 2008 financial crisis and this more recent pandemic crisis, we observed an increased attention paid to social economy, social and solidarity economy as a solution to new and old social problems. So there is an increasing attention paid to the role of social economy. Of course, this focus on the ways in which the social economy can have a role in our society brings also an attention to the instruments to support the development of this sector. And finance is among the instruments, the tools for this development. So we have to see the finance as a supporting tool, supporting instruments in order to expand the capacity of social and solidarity economy organization in providing an answer to new needs of our social organizations. In recent years, of course, we we saw different elements in the dialogue, in the conversation about finance for social economy. First of all, of course, the need for finance is not something peculiar of social and solidarity economy organization. Those organizations are mainly enterprises, and as every economic actor, they have a need for finance dictated by the need for growth. So they share with for-profit corporations many financial mechanisms. But of course, there is also a difference in terms of access to those instruments. And this is what I want to focus on in the next few minutes. Another point in the framework in which we do discuss today the financial instruments for the development of social and solidarity economy is a transformation, is a change in the kind of activities that those organizations are providing for our societies. We observe an increasing number of capital-intensive sectors. For instance, in the energy sector, in some countries like for instance, in Germany or in Italy, we had in the last years a boom of what we call energy communities based mainly on a cooperative model. And of course, if you have to run operations in a sector that has also an infrastructural need, like the energy sector, this sector is per se a capital-intensive sector. And the same also, for instance, in the waste management sector or in the management of heritage, cultural heritage goods, and so on. So we have this element that should be considered, that we have more and more a trend in being present as social economic organizations in sectors where the capital is important in terms of investments. This, of course, has to do also with a traditional notion of social economy organization with a weak relationship with all the elements concerning profit. There is a preconceived notion of this sector as economically fragile. This is not the case, of course, and we have many empirical elements showing that the entrepreneurial side of those organizations is more and more important. A final point on this general picture is that today there are many other actors that are trying to merge economic and social dimensions in their activity, in their actions. There is a rebranding of financial institutions, especially after the crisis of 2008, that makes some of the for-profit private financial institutions more and more focused also on providing products that are based also on the involvement of social elements, social dimension. Just think to the importance of ESG in the allocation of financial resources nowadays by many international financial actors. With ILO, EURICSE made a research, a report that was commissioned by ILO and funded by the government of Luxembourg 3 years ago, where the research question was exactly for what purpose financial resources are being used by the SSE organizations, and in what ways they can be accessed. Was a study in 3 stages. The first stage was developing an overview of financial sources and mechanisms. A second stage was 8 country studies on different realities like South Korea, Morocco, and Cape Verde, Quebec, Colombia, and Ecuador, Luxembourg, and Italy. What is interesting is that 4 of these countries have a new reports just updated that will be published in a few weeks by ILO. We have just finished this work. And the third stage of this analysis was about the cross-cutting themes and related recommendations. So let us see very briefly the main elements that I have a problem with my screen. Okay. The main elements coming out from this research, from this report. First of all, a methodological observation, assessing the demand for finance, the demand by social economy is quite difficult for 2 different reasons. The first one is that we lack of data. We have not a clear representation, statistical representation, empirical evidence of the ways those organizations access to capital. And the second element is that when we talk about social and solidarity economy organizations, we do include a large variety of actors with a huge difference in terms of financial needs, in terms of sectors, size, life cycle, and so on. If we talk about a large, for instance, a large consumer cooperative with millions of members, of course, we do have financial needs that are completely different from a small social cooperative dealing with a very specific action on the territory. So it's difficult to go across all those differences and extracting a common layout of financial needs. What's different about those organizations when it comes to finance? Well, first of all, I would like to underline that in terms of needs, of general needs, there is not such a big difference with for-profit organization, because we are talking about enterprises engaged in the production of goods and services, like every other enterprises. And so, of course, they have financial needs to cover the startup phase, or to cover cash flow issues, or to cover investments for the growth, exactly as the other enterprises. So from a conceptual point of view, there is no reason to say that financial needs of social economic organizations are really different from those of any other type of enterprise. But at the same time, those organizations do differ from traditional for-profit enterprises because they do meet the needs of a larger share of stakeholders, not only those who have a stake in terms of capital participation in the enterprise, but also workers, also clients, also volunteers, so different categories. So the main focus is not to remunerate investors, and of course also the governance structures are different from the for-profit organizations, and this makes difficult to apply the same financial tools that are traditionally used by for-profit corporations. If you cannot remunerate the capital, of course, there are some instruments that are not suitable for the growth of these sector. So I want to stress this point because the specificity of social economy with respect to the issue of finance is not in terms of needs. The needs are comparable to traditional companies. The specificity is rather in terms of the ways in which these resources can be accessed, the financial resources can be accessed. And so, looking to this scheme, you see we have on the demand side a number of different organizations that are different in terms of size and needs, but generally speaking, they are not so uncomparable with for-profit organizations. But on the supply side, you have a number of actors that can be activated that is larger, usually larger than the actors activated by the for-profit organization, because the internal mechanisms are different from the mechanisms activated by the shareholder enterprises. The main financial mechanism that we observed during our research as used by social economy organizations are mainly can be divided into two main categories. The first one is that internal instruments, especially instruments based on the social base. So those are resources coming out from the members, from the people directly involved in the activity of the organization, and from the management, so from the access to the market through products and services, so through the own activity, the activity of the organization. Internal financing mechanisms are the most important for the life of these organizations, more than the external one that can be categorized as grant, so donation or semi-donation, or debt or equity, or a mix of these different tools. If we look to the trend of these last years, and we do a projection of these trends into the future, we see that the financial needs are also influenced by the kind of role that you see in terms of relationship with the context. I want to explain this with two examples. In some contexts of our national case studies, for instance, Ecuador and Cape Verde, you have a remedial role of social economic organizations that is prevalent. It means that those organizations are committed mainly in contrasting poverty and favoring social inclusion. In these areas, with this role, you will see a prevalence of public funding and a less stringent constraints in terms of economic sustainability, because the social function is prevalent also because it's a public function. In other contexts, you have a more systemic role. You have organization aiming not just to face the contrasts of poverty or the social inclusion, but rather you have a whole alternative way of organizing economic activity. So you have many sectors that are influenced by this systemic approach. In this case, you will see organizations based more on entrepreneurial activities, more taking business risks, so more autonomous with respect to public resources, and more alternative to the mainstream approach. In both cases, so in the remedial case and in the systemic case, ecosystems are quite crucial in terms of accessing financial resources. This was quite evident in the 8 cases that were studied in the report. We saw in 3 of the areas that have been analyzed, that when you have a cooperative district, a social economy district, where many different actors of different size, different sectors are interacting with each other, the access to the financial instruments are much more fluent, easy. So the quality of the ecosystem determines the articulation of the financial system, not vice versa. Where the ecosystem are fragile, financial instruments are more limited. And in some cases, even they can hinder the development of the organizations. I'm going to finish just stressing the importance, as I've already said, of the internal sources of capital. Where social economy ecosystems are stronger, the financial needs are mainly satisfied by internal funding and by more traditional financial instruments, like, for instance, bank loans, or ethical banks, or cooperative banks, in a way that is incentivized by a supportive legal framework. For instance, in countries where you have profit distribution constraints or an asset lock, you will see that ecosystems are much more robust and efficient. On the other side, the newly developed financial instruments, in our observation, in the analysis that we did in the 8 cases, are less relevant, except for the instruments that are a direct projection of the social economic organizations. What I wanted to stress here is that there is quite a significant mistrust by social economy actors on innovations from the world of impact investment, such, for instance, social impact bonds or other kind of instruments like the pay for results instruments, because they are not seen as results of a demand coming from the sector, but are seen more as an expression of needs of repositioning of the financial sector. And this is a point. Another point is that about the measurement or the evaluation of social impact. This is a key requirement in all forms of impact investing, but is still a very controversial subject, because no agreement, there is no agreement on the ways, on the instruments, on the methods of these measurements. The criteria and indicators to be used are difficult to be balanced between the interest of investors and the interest of the organizations who are beneficiaries. And there is also a series of unintended consequences, like, for instance, the choice by the investors of the projects that are easier to evaluate, a kind of commodification of service users in terms of tackling all those organizations or projects or activities that are much easier to approach and so consequently much easier to be measured. I want to finish saying that, of course, the COVID crisis have had an impact on the finance for the social economy in terms of erosion of assets that we have seen during the crisis, but also in positive terms, not only in negative terms, because we assisted to a push toward innovation, especially about technologies, digitalization, as a consequence of the crisis, a request of new services, and new services that are more embedded in technologies. And also we observed an increase in social needs. So the trend is an increased importance of social economy in this framework, and consequently an increased importance of financial resources. Finally, just summing up, we saw in the last few years the organizations belonging to the social and solidarity economy engaging in more and more capital-intensive activities. I already mentioned the waste management, the energy communities, but also the urban renewal or the management of facilities for cultural activities and so on. Social housing is another example. All this engagement is expected to increase in the next future. This means that the social economy organization must be better equipped to face those challenges with new models, new tools capable of coping with more massive demand for goods and services. And this, from a financial perspective, means a development of an adequate supply of a blended approach. A blended approach, I mean, mixing different tools, different strategies, mainly internal tools, but not only, also external tools, but consistent with the identity and the specificities of the social and solidarity economy organizations. Those are the main findings that I wanted to highlight. Of course, the full report is available on the website of the ILO and of EURICSE. And in the next few weeks, you will find also the new 5 case studies updated after the COVID emergencies. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianluca. Excellent presentation. I really appreciate your inputs. I think the distinction that you made between the sort of the remedial angle, which requires or is primarily publicly funded, versus the more engagement in the broader economy, which reaches out to more private investments, I think is a really interesting distinction to make. And you also talk a lot about sort of the role of sort of cooperative banks or the funding structures within the cooperative system and how they are responding to the needs of cooperatives or mutuals. I was wondering though, in terms of those social enterprises that aren't cooperatively structured, are they also getting access to services through the cooperative banks or investors from the cooperative world, or are there new financial structures that are emerging to reach out to social enterprises that aren't cooperatively based?
Well, I would say that it depends on the density of the ecosystem in which those organizations operates. I mean, if you have a well-structured and well-articulated ecosystem, you will find many different instruments and tools. I mentioned the traditional banking sector, but also new tools can be blended into this approach. But if you are in a reality where all these connections are weak, new social enterprises will be conditioned by the offer, by the supply. But the supply has its own identity. So the risk is that social enterprises outside that are not connected to a good ecosystem are not an active actor in terms of choice of the instruments, but they have to comply with the existing instruments that often are not suited or are not able to react to the specific needs of these organizations. So they are weaker in terms of power of contracting.
Okay, thanks for that. So there's a question in the Q&A for you. It's from Dr. Martin, and he says, or she says, as diversity is key to tackle the challenges faced by humanity right now, such as biodiversity, do you think that financial diversity is crucial? And for instance, local currencies, an example that she gives is the one in Switzerland, the WIR, or the Palamas in Brazil. Do you think that these models can offer monetary diversity and contribute to a shift in the financial power? So do you find that's true, or do you find that interesting? you have some thoughts on the local currencies.
I agree, but I would say that local currencies are a very interesting instrument in terms of local development. I don't see yet the capacity of those tools to face large challenges. And as we see that social economy is becoming more and more an actor, a systemic actor, we need also financial tools that can accompany those actors in a much more than local environment. So the problem is at local level, yes. On national or international level, not yet, because I mean the content of these new currencies is basically rooted in local communities, so they do not have the perception of how to deal with a large scale.
And they're also not limited to social enterprises, presumably.
Yeah.
Excellent. So I think with that, why don't we turn to the panel that we have? And I understand we may be short a panelist who has connection problems. So we'll get started with the panelists that we have. And the idea is to take what Gianluca has talked about at a higher sort of macro level, sort of more general trends, and see how they play out in 3 or 4 countries, depending on what panelists are able to join us. Certainly Korea, we have Jonghyun Park from the Geosprang National University in Korea, who's joined us here. And from Morocco, we have Mohamed Bazi. And from Portugal, we have Filipe Almeida. And we have a colleague from Argentina who may or may not be able to join us, Claudia Simonte. So the idea here is to sort of hear about some of the innovations that are taking place at a national level and understand how those innovations are being designed to support the financing of social and solidarity enterprises. And why don't we start with Mr. Park from Korea. If you could let us know if there's some examples in Korea where financial service providers are particularly targeting social and solidarity enterprises.
Hello, my name is Jonghyun Park from South Korea. Thank you for having me. And I briefly introduced the Korean case. At the end of the 2020, there were approximately 65 social financial institutions that specifically serve social and solidarity enterprises or organizations. Among them, the most influential SSE financiers is the Korea Social Value and Solidarity Foundation, which is usually called as SVS. SVS is a wholesale social financial institution, and over the past 2 years, it has provided 19.4 billion won, about 1.4 billion euros to social economic organizations in the collaboration with various retail social financial institutions in partnership. SVS has several missions such as supporting retail social financial institutions, helping social investors, promoting policy and non-government financial cooperation, creating a social financial ecosystem to promote a regional development and spread social solidarity models. And I have something to tell more about it, about other people's, yes, that's finished, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So this SVS sounds like it's a really interesting example. So we'll come back to you to get some more details as the conversation unfolds. Let's turn now to Mr. Bazi, Mohamed Bazi, from the university in Morocco. If you could give us some insights as to models of financiers in Morocco that are serving this market.
Merci. Alors, bonjour. Je veux tout d'abord exprimer ma vive gratitude pour votre invitation, ainsi que pour l'intérêt perpétuel que vous exprimez aux problématiques sociales qui tiennent à cœur, sans nul doute, à tout l'auditoire. Alors, aujourd'hui, c'est un réel plaisir d'être avec vous. Alors, le Royaume du Maroc dispose d'une multitude de moyens de financement et continue aussi à se doter de nouveaux moyens, comme ce fut le cas très récemment par l'adoption du cadre juridique permettant au crowdfunding, par exemple, de démarrer. C'est-à-dire que aussi le Maroc porte un intérêt indéniable à ce secteur avec une stratégie pour l'ESS, une stratégie qui a été reconfigurée avec une nouvelle stratégie de l'ESS entre 2018 et 2028. Seulement, l'ensemble de ces mécanismes ou l'ensemble des mécanismes financiers disponibles aujourd'hui ne cible pas d'une façon spécifique le secteur de l'ESS. Je pense notamment, par exemple, à la microfinance qui obéit à des schémas du type social business ou aux autres prêts accordés aux auto-entrepreneurs disponibles dans notre contexte, pour les uns depuis longtemps et pour les autres depuis très récemment. Et on va en reparler, je l'espère, tout à l'heure. Donc, toutefois, nous avons depuis 2005 une initiative étatique, l'INDH, l'Initiative nationale pour le développement humain, qui est une grande initiative au Maroc, qui a contribué d'une façon directe et indirecte à décupler le nombre d'organisations de l'ESS. Je pense particulièrement aux associations et aux coopératives. Par exemple, le nombre d'associations est passé de quelques 3800 en 2004 à plus de 150 000 et plus aujourd'hui, selon les chiffres officiels, et selon les mêmes chiffres, les coopératives pour la même période sont passées de quelques 5 200 à plus de 34 500 et comme vous l'avez dit, les chiffres sont approximatifs faute de données avérées. Donc cette initiative aujourd'hui, cette initiative nationale pour le développement humain est un des plus grands chantiers sociaux au Maroc. C'est une initiative qui vise en gros à décroître la pauvreté, l'exclusion sociale et malheureusement l'ESS dans notre contexte est généralement associé justement à cette facette-là, vu, on va dire, le fait que beaucoup d'organismes, beaucoup d'organisations dans l'ESS sont ou bien évoluent dans des couches défavorisées et parfois dans des régions enclavées du royaume. Donc aujourd'hui, cette initiative est une initiative globale, générale, qui vise avec beaucoup de moyens de financement et en concertation avec d'autres organismes, maintenant à faire en sorte que l'ESS puisse trouver les moyens de financement nécessaires à leur développement. Car on le sait tous, comme l'a dit Gianluca tout à l'heure, les besoins de financement sont des besoins qui sont pressants et qui sont présents partout. Maintenant, le fait de les adapter à des organismes de l'ESS qui n'ont pas ce retour simple, ce retour pécuniaire sur investissement, le return on investment, ou qui vont avoir plutôt un retour social sur investissement qui est très difficilement mesurable, rend la tâche des financeurs des plus complexes et des plus compliquées.
Great. Thank you, Mohamed. We'll come back to you in a minute to get more details about this national initiative to better understand how it's structured. But let's first move to Filipe from Portugal. Filipe Almeida is president of Portugal's Social Engineering, which I think is a government initiative. So Filipe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Craig. Actually, it's Portugal's Social Innovation, not engineering, while sometimes it seems like engineering. So as asked by the organization and agreed with Craig, I was supposed to do my presentation in Portuguese. However, I wasn't able to access the translation. I don't know if it's really working. So my first brief presentation, I will do it in English. And if you, Craig, can confirm that translation is working, then I can go with the Portuguese language. So briefly, thank you very much for the invitation. It's very good to be here and hear these different stories about Portugal. Portugal Social Innovation, the organization that I'm leading, is a government initiative. It is a pioneering public policy program in Europe, because Portugal was the only member state up until today that reserved a share of European structural funds to experiment new financing instruments and promote social innovation from a centralized public policy program. So what is Portugal Social Innovation? As I said, it's a government initiative that mobilizes European structural funds in the programming period that is now coming to an end, with two basic objectives. First, to promote and finance social innovation projects. Second, to develop the social investment market in Portugal. And to reach these two objectives, we've created 4 financing instruments with 2 basic assumptions. First, each of these 4 instruments is aligned with a specific stage of development of a social innovation project. So it addresses specific financing needs of the projects and specific potential impact potentials for different projects, in different levels of maturity. And the second assumption, all of these instruments assume the development of partnerships between the social organizations that develop the projects and the investors, private or public. In a nutshell, these 4 instruments, they are all blended finance solutions. And we have first a grant-based capacity building program for developing management competencies in these organizations. Second, we have a match fund that leverages philanthropy. Third, we have a social impact bonds program, which is, as you know, an outcome payment instrument that finances projects based on a payment by results, projects that are aligned with public policy priorities. And finally, we have not a financing instruments, as the 3 of the other are, but a financial instrument, which is the Social Innovation Fund, which has 2 solutions, 2 streams. A debt stream that provides guarantees for loans, and an equity stream that co-invests in equity of SMEs alongside with private investors. So we have all these kind of instruments going, grant-based, debt, equity, and social impact bonds, to address different needs of the national ecosystem. May I say that the focus is on promoting social innovation. It means to create the conditions so that the civil society organizations and social economy organizations and sometimes business organizations can experiment new solutions for social problems, to develop new products, new services, new methodologies that can help to address complex interdependent social problems. And the underlying reasoning is that the notion that actually the underlying belief, just to conclude, the underlying belief behind the creation of this public policy back in December 2014 was the notion that the public sector would never have, the government would never have enough resources or competencies to deal effectively with all social problems. And the vision that the social entrepreneurship and this partnership with the social organizations and with involvement of private sector could actually be an effective way to create new solutions. So these cross-sector partnerships between the public sector, the private sector, and the social sector is one of the key solutions to our common future. That was the underlying vision behind the creation of Portugal Social Innovation. And I must say that to this day, we have already approved 587 projects all over the country, which represent around 124 million euros of financing, of which 40 million euros comes from social investment. 85% of the organizations that are experimenting these new solutions are social economy organizations. more than 80% of the financing needs that we are addressing are for social economy organizations, because that's the main cradle of innovation for social problems. Thanks, Greg.
So thank you, Filipe. So on the translation issue, on the bottom of the screen, there's on the far right-hand side, there's a button that says the languages. I don't know if you have, maybe you don't have that.
Maybe I don't have the most updated version of this platform, Zoom platform. No, okay. For me, that's fine. We can go on in English, no problem for me. It's easy if it's easier for everyone.
It's not easier for those people whose first language is Portuguese, but
yes,
that's okay.
Okay.
If we don't have it, we don't have it. Let me just follow up with you. So it sounds like a really interesting initiative, Portuguese social innovation for social engineering. How did it get started, and how was it created?
Well, as I said, the Portuguese government. Well, let me just a brief historic background. Back in 2014, Portugal was living under severe austerity measures after signing a 3-year economic adjustment agreement with the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, as you know. And as the Portuguese government was having no access to the debt market and was highly dependent on EU funding, the increasing social needs were being addressed mainly by more traditional social organizations and emerging social entrepreneurs groups that were addressing these issues. By that time, in Portugal, it was created a specialized task force led by the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, which is the biggest private foundation in Portugal, that gathered several leading organizations in order to present a report for boosting social investment in Portugal. At the same time, the Portuguese government was negotiating with the European Commission the next programming period. And the vision of the government was that with all these resources, with all these activities that we were seeing in the civil society organizations and entrepreneurial area, and with this report from the task force, the vision was, okay, let's experiment, let's negotiate with the European Commission a small share of the European structural funds, namely 150 million euros of the European Social Fund, and let's try to experiment new financing instruments that can really boost this social innovation ecosystem in Portugal. So this was the first vision. Contrary to what's happening all over the world, in Portugal, it was a public initiative, a government initiative that mobilized the ecosystem and developed the ecosystem. It was, it had some potential, but it was not organized yet. So it was a public initiative that became the main catalyzer of this social innovation ecosystem in Portugal. It's actually been quite an interesting experience.
Well, it sounds really interesting, and I like the way that you are thinking about different stages of the development of social enterprises and how they need different instruments to tackle those different stages. Mm-hmm. All right, let's switch back to Korea. And Mr. Park, you're telling us about the SVS and how it was a wholesaler. So if you could just say a little bit more about how they got created and who owns them, and what are the financial instruments that they have?
Yes, SVS was established in 2019 through the process of a public-private partnership with the cooperation of financial authorities, which was part of the social economy revitalization policy since the emergence of Moon Jae-in regime, which has been favorable to the social and solidarity economy. The legal form of SVS is a non-profit public interest foundation, and it raised 25 billion won, about 19 million euros from various contributing organizations, including commercial banks, consumer co-ops, and credit unions. And the biggest difference between SVS and traditional financial institutions is that SVS assumes social economic organizations and projects with social missions, including social impact bonds, as key customer growth. Another important difference is that SVS systemically considers the impact of funding as well as the economic sustainability of the SSE organizations. By the way, SVS is also quite different from the existing social financial institutions. In addition to loan-type financial support, SVS is also interested in investment-type financial support, like equity fund. It is also characterized by increasing the overall size of social finance and creating an ecosystem by providing catalytic capital or first loss capital. At the end of 2020, of the 65 social finance institutions, 15 institutions, which account for 23% of the total, had partnership with SVS. Thank you.
So just so that I understand, so SVS makes a co-investment with banks in social enterprises and takes a first loss. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. SVS offers provide some matching fund to existing financial social finance institutions, intermediaries. So that means that facilitating or accelerating or increasing the amount of capital to the social economic enterprises, and if that social economic organizations fails to refund the money, the first loss capital, the SVS covers the loss from the failure. So the other investors or the other investors endures the loss.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Now let's go back to Morocco. Mohamed, you were talking about the National Institute for Human Development. How is it created and who owns it and how is it structured?
D'accord. Merci à vous. Donc, premièrement, je tiens à souligner que la nécessité de pallier aux problèmes sociaux a toujours été d'actualité dans toute la région nord-africaine, comme en témoignent les mouvements de contestation populaire qu'a connu, par exemple, toute la région en fin 2010. Alors, au Maroc, nous n'y avons pas échappé et en 2003, nous avons eu des attentats qui ont sonné comme une corrélation entre pauvreté, malintégration sociale et engagement islamiste. Donc, l'intégration par le travail est devenue une orientation majeure, voire une sortie que les organisations de l'économie sociale et solidaire, comme les coopératives, qui sont réputées pour faciliter justement ce type d'insertion, ont procuré. Alors, nous avons eu cette initiative qui est une initiative qui a été initiée sous les instructions du roi du Maroc, Mohamed VI, en 2005. Et cette initiative est passée par 3 grandes phases. Donc, nous avons eu une phase entre 2006 et 2011, une seconde entre 2011 et 2015, et la 3e phase dans laquelle nous sommes aujourd'hui, qui a débuté en 2019 et qui, normalement, est supposée être une initiative qui va, une phase qui demeurera jusqu'à 2023. Alors aujourd'hui, elle est gérée par le ministère de l'Intérieur avec un budget pour la 3e phase uniquement de quelques 18 milliards de dirhams, soit à peu près 1,7 milliard d'euros selon le cours de change d'aujourd'hui. Son budget est ventilé à 60% du budget général de l'État, à 30% de celui des collectivités locales qui sont aussi très présentes dans le système de gouvernance et à 10% par la coopération internationale. Alors, en parlant de gouvernance, ici, l'appartenance en fait de cette initiative demeure un projet de règne. C'est une initiative qui est étatique somme toute et qui, par ses organes de gouvernance, on va comprendre que c'est disons qu'elle appartient à l'État. Regardez, son comité stratégique est présidé par le chef du gouvernement. Vous avez un comité de pilotage qui est présidé par le ministre de l'Intérieur. Et puis, vous avez des coordinations. Et ces coordinations, ce qui est intéressant ici, c'est que les coordinations vont être en même temps d'un point de vue national, dirigé par un wali coordonnateur national de l'INDH. C'est un grade similaire à celui d'un gouverneur. Et puis, vous avez au niveau régional des comités régionaux, des comités dans chaque province et puis dans chaque localité, et vous avez des comités locaux pour le développement humain. Alors, ce qui va rendre aussi cette question de mesure de ce que fait ou ne fait pas l'INDH intéressante, c'est le fait que ce mécanisme de financement, son implémentation et sa gouvernance se sont faites par des instances gouvernementales ayant un lien avec ce ministère justement de l'Intérieur, ce qui va faciliter grandement la collecte des informations ciblées là où d'autres mécanismes n'ont pas cette possibilité. Aussi, le fait d'avoir cette approche mixte entre un pilotage national et puis un pilotage local permettra bien évidemment en fait d'injecter, on va dire, des actions là où il le faut, d'injecter des actions finalement de type financement, de type accompagnement, parce qu'il n'y a pas que le financement, il y a tout l'écosystème qui va avec, même la mise en valeur, la valorisation, on va dire, des infrastructures de base pour aider un petit peu ces organisations, entre autres, à atteindre leurs objectifs sociaux. Ça va justement être rendu possible par justement le fait finalement que on soit dans cette optique, dans cette logique, en fin de compte, qui est fédératrice. Comme j'ai dit, cette logique-là profite d'une façon directe et aussi d'une façon indirecte à ces organismes de l'économie sociale et solidaire. Je vous remercie.
Well, thank you. I just to clarify, the discussion about Korea showed that it was very much combining sort of public funds with private funds to try to support social enterprises. But in Morocco's case, is there private financing as well, or it's all purely public financing?
Alors, d'accord. Alors, pour l'initiative nationale pour le développement humain, si on prend juste cette initiative-là, il s'agit d'une initiative qui va financer les organisations de l'économie sociale et solidaire par le biais de financement à fonds perdu, c'est-à-dire de subventions. Toutefois, ces subventions vont se faire à hauteur de 70% selon les montages financiers d'un projet où on va aussi faciliter l'accès pour le reliquat, par exemple, soit à des associations de microfinance, d'une part, soit dans d'autres circonstances, avec, par exemple, une dernière initiative, un programme intégré d'appui des financements des entreprises qui a été impulsé très récemment. C'est un programme finalement où on va voir aussi la facilitation en fait de l'accès au financement à plusieurs types de catégories, les jeunes diplômés, les auto-entrepreneurs et les coopératives. Donc, regardez, là encore une fois, nous avons un impact indirect qui va toucher les organisations de l'économie sociale et solidaire et qui vont se faire sous forme de prêts avec des taux d'intérêt préférentiels à 2%, ce qui est très, très bas par rapport à ce que nous avons, où le financement pourra toucher soit les investissements, les dépenses d'exploitation, OPEX, CAPEX, les fonds de roulement et ainsi de suite. Donc, si on parle uniquement de l'initiative, bien sûr, c'est une initiative, disons, étatique, mais bien sûr, dans son écosystème, elle permet à des acteurs locaux, à des acteurs privés, bien évidemment, de s'intégrer dans ce modèle de financement, somme toute, dans le but de pouvoir octroyer à l'économie sociale et solidaire, à quelques organismes, bien sûr, la possibilité de se développer et de financer leurs activités.
Maybe just while I still have you, if you could explain how if there's any way of measuring the social returns, is that part of the agenda? And if so, how do they measure it?
Alors, oui, alors la question déjà de la mesure de l'impact social demeure très difficulteuse, comme souligné tout à l'heure, dans plusieurs contextes. Et le nôtre n'échappe pas, ne déroge pas à cette règle. Alors, les associations de microfinancement, par exemple, qui contribuent à financer le reliquat, mesurent par exemple ce retour social sur investissement par leur taux de recouvrement. Alors, une diminution, par exemple, ici, est un signe favorable. Un chiffre qui est rapidement biaisé lors de notre présence prolongée dans le terrain, nous avons eu la confirmation que beaucoup de bénéficiaires justement de ces moyens de financement, des coopératives pour la grande majorité, rachètent des prêts par d'autres prêts, procèdent à des rachats de prêts par d'autres prêts, ce qui engendre un phénomène finalement de dépendance financière, contrairement à cette idée d'indépendance des financements souhaités au départ. Alors, pour l'INDH, il n'y a pas eu non plus de mesure proprement dite du retour social sur investissement. Toutefois, nous avons procédé à l'évaluation des 2 premières phases préliminaires et la conclusion était en fait que le retour était en deçà des prévisions, à cause notamment du fait que le soutien de ces projets générateurs de revenus s'est essentiellement concentré sur des activités de subsistance. C'est ce que j'avais dit au départ de ma présentation, avec les zones enclavées, avec tout ceci. Donc, nous avons eu des projets financés qui servaient uniquement à la subsistance. Alors, il n'y avait pas, bien évidemment, de réelle approche projet au sein des chaînes de valeur, ce qui entravait un petit peu, disons, le retour. Aussi, par rapport à quelques recherches que nous avons menées, il s'est avéré que le phénomène de dépendance financière était engagé. C'est-à-dire que finalement, donner un financement à fonds perdu sous forme de subventionnement pour ces entreprises-là ou ces activités qui génèrent des revenus, somme toute, n'était pas corrélé positivement nécessairement avec la pérennité de la structure créée. C'est-à-dire que là, il fallait bien évidemment voir ce qu'il faut faire, ce qu'il faut entamer pour bien évidemment jouer sur ce paramètre qui est la pérennité. Peut-être était-ce l'accompagnement et un accompagnement qui soit professionnel. Pour ce qui est du retour financier, bien qu'il soit difficilement aussi appréciable, les chiffres officiels de l'INDH parlent de 43 milliards de dirhams d'investissement générés justement par cette initiative, dont 28 milliards de dirhams générés par le budget de l'INDH. Alors, on met en avant un effet de levier de 53% selon les données justement de l'INDH. Alors, ici, je reprends une idée que j'ai dite tout à l'heure. Ce qui rend cette question de mesure plus aisée pour l'INDH que pour un autre mécanisme maintenant de financement, c'est le fait qu'il soit implémenté de 2 manières, une fois d'une façon nationale et une autre fois d'une façon locale. Et que aussi celui qui l'a implémenté, c'est le ministère de l'Intérieur. Donc, ce qui facilite grandement un petit peu la collecte d'informations ciblées là où d'autres mécanismes n'ont pas cette possibilité. Mais clairement, est-ce que nous avons aujourd'hui des indicateurs pour pouvoir mesurer? Est-ce qu'il y a des indicateurs généralement accepté pour cette mesure, du retour social d'investissement? Je dirais clairement non. En revanche, on se basera sur des cycles de financement, des cycles de production, de commercialisation. On se basera sur une pérennité, donc sur une longévité finalement de la structure créée. Et in fine, bien évidemment, aujourd'hui, il serait très profitable d'avoir un système justement de mesure de ce retour social sur investissement.
Yeah, no, I think that's a common problem. Maybe Filipe, over to you. In Portugal, You've got this special fund that's set aside for social enterprises. How do you know that they're social, and how do you see whether they're achieving the objectives that you hope that they will achieve?
Okay, Craig, I finally found the function for translation. It was my mistake, so my apologies to the organization, to you, and to the Portuguese language speakers. So if you don't mind, I will change to Portuguese, this beautiful ancient language. Bom, em relação à pergunta que fez, em Portugal, como garantimos o foco da Portugal Inovação Social, é a inovação social. Portanto, independentemente do formato organizacional, o que procuramos é a proposta de novos produtos, novas soluções, novas metodologias que apresentem uma abordagem inovadora aos problemas sociais. O que acontece é que a generalidade destas organizações são organizações da economia social. Como é que nós garantimos que os projetos dão resposta a problemas sociais? Através da análise da proposta que se faz, primeiro avaliamos se existe um problema social de acordo com os termos que é apresentado, se a proposta é diferenciada daquelas que existem oferecidas pelo Estado ou pelo setor privado e se tem potencial de impacto positivo nos grupos sociais mais vulneráveis que são identificados. Porque a base da inovação social, o seu objetivo é combater desigualdades estruturais, promover a autonomia daqueles que entre nós são mais vulneráveis, e é esse o foco de todos os projetos. Eu chamo a atenção, no entanto, todos estes projetos que estamos a financiar, como referi, 587 à data de hoje, são projetos experimentais e, portanto, a escala destes projetos para nós não é relevante. Pode ser um projeto pequeno, ao nível do bairro ou da cidade, pode ser um projeto regional, ao nível de toda uma região. O importante é a experimentação que se está a fazer com determinados grupos sociais mais vulneráveis. E a ligação que depois se consegue fazer com a política pública, porque o objetivo final aqui, um deles, é, porventura, inspirar também a evolução de políticas públicas, não ficar apenas numa lógica de financiamento da atividade de organizações sociais, mas provocar uma real parceria destas organizações com o setor público, de maneira a que consigamos criar novas soluções. Relativamente aos indicadores e aos resultados, todos os projetos aprovados, exceto no caso do instrumento para capacitação destas organizações, todos os projetos são aprovados com indicadores de resultado previamente contratualizados. Portanto, nós contratualizamos indicadores de resultados, e claro está que são indicadores que possam ser verificáveis no curto prazo, mas são indicadores que pressupõem também impactos no médio e longo prazo. O instrumento que é mais rigoroso desse ponto de vista é, naturalmente, os títulos de impacto social, Social Impact Bonds, onde, nesse caso, estamos a falar de resultados sociais mensuráveis, que têm que ser contratualizados, porque o reembolso dos investidores é feito mediante o alcance desse resultado, e, neste caso em particular, nós juntamos obrigatoriamente à parceria que se candidata aos nossos fundos a entidade pública responsável pela política pública setorial. Portanto, no caso dos títulos de impacto social em Portugal, quem se candidata é o prestador de serviço, a organização empreendedora, o investidor que se compromete a financiar integralmente o projeto e ainda também em parceria a entidade pública, que nos diz que valida o projeto, os indicadores, as metas e acompanha. Sem fluxos financeiros, mas acompanha o processo. Nós, Portugal Inovação Social, atuamos como outcome payer, mas o futuro pagador por resultados será, porventura, a entidade pública que acompanha o processo para que ele possa ser integrado. Então, estamos a fazer um caminho, como o Mohamed também referia, ainda não há um consenso sobre metodologias standard para avaliar impacto social. Uma parte dos projetos que financiamos, eles próprios estão a fazer avaliação de impacto bem aprofundada e nós acompanhamos esse processo. Não é obrigatório ainda da nossa parte, mas penso que no futuro a evolução destes mecanismos de financiamento deverá tornar obrigatória essa avaliação de impacto imediata, mas que faça também uma projeção para o futuro. E já uma última coisa, Craig, já agora, em relação a algumas das coisas que o Gianluca Salvatori também mencionou, que me lembrou algumas das aprendizagens em Portugal sobre a tensão que existe entre organizações sociais e estes mecanismos de financiamento. Quando a Portugal Inovação Social foi criada, havia a ideia no ecossistema de que era orientada especificamente para startups, empresas sociais. E o setor mais tradicional da economia social estaria um pouco colocado de lado. Era um equívoco. E a realidade veio comprovar que o setor mais tradicional da economia social é também gerador de muita inovação. Nós aprendemos também, com esta experiência, a distinguir a inovação disruptiva da inovação incremental. É a economia social mais tradicional que está melhor posicionada para experimentar abordagens de inovação incremental para melhorar as respostas que temos, porque eles próprios são protagonistas de respostas sociais atualmente. Então, tudo isto tem que fazer parte do mesmo pacote de soluções e nós somos um programa muito aberto a estas várias possibilidades. E a economia social revelou-se, de facto, comprovadamente inovadora, como na verdade sempre foi. E neste caso também não podia ser diferente. Back to you.
So, just on the social impact bond piece, if you could give an example of one that's operating now, and then Gianluca, you were reasonably critical of social impact bonds, so I would ask you to come in and react to the example that Filipe is giving, to put you on the spot.
Muito bem.
Yeah.
Shall I give the example? My turn? Ok. Back to Portuguese, sorry. Dos exemplos, nós temos atualmente 21 títulos de impacto social em Portugal. Posso dar-vos o exemplo do primeiro, o mais antigo. O mais antigo título de impacto social que estamos a financiar, o Code Academy Bootcamp, a tradução seria isto, é um título que se propõe desenvolver uma metodologia inovadora de formação intensiva em programação para jovens desempregados de qualquer área científica. No fundo, é uma requalificação uma proposta de requalificação de competências para um setor com grande necessidade de mão de obra especializada. Foi desenvolvido numa região interior do país, portanto, foi deslocado para essa região do interior mais vulnerável, mais remota, esse programa, atraiu pessoas de todo o país e o contrato que fizeram connosco foi a empregabilidade 50% de cada uma das turmas, num conjunto de cerca de 200 jovens desempregados, 50% de empregabilidade 3 meses depois da intervenção. Nesse título de impacto social, como eu referia, para garantir que ele está alinhado com prioridades de política pública, juntou-se também a entidade nacional que executa política pública na área do emprego, o IEFP, Instituto de Emprego e Formação Profissional, que desde a primeira hora validou a intervenção e os resultados que eles se propunham alcançar quando comparados com o êxito que a política pública também consegue. E, portanto, confirmado com a política pública, avançou-se com esse processo e o que acontece é que já está a chegar ao fim neste momento e todos os resultados foram alcançados, portanto eles conseguiram sempre atingir pelo menos 50% de empregabilidade após a intervenção. Onde é que está a dificuldade aqui? A dificuldade está em colocar um valor nesse resultado. Então o modelo que temos em Portugal, não sendo mais ajustado, neste caso é um modelo baseado em despesas reais, em custos reais, o que significa que, uma vez atingido o resultado, ele é o requisito necessário para reembolsar o investidor de todo o investimento real que ele fez para atingir esse resultado. Não é muito interessante nem atraente para o investidor um modelo como este, não é alinhado com o princípio dos títulos de impacto social, mas foi o que tivemos até agora. Já agora um último detalhe, para que este investimento em títulos de impacto social se tornasse mais atrativo para o investidor privado, uma vez que com fundos europeus não podemos remunerar o investidor, portanto, só podemos reembolsar as despesas que teve, criámos em Portugal, em 2018, um incentivo fiscal que permite uma dedução automática de 30% de todo o investimento em títulos de impacto social, independentemente do seu reembolso futuro. Portanto, através da política fiscal nacional, criámos um incentivo para que investimento privado pudesse financiar esta experimentação em parceria com o setor público. Este é um dos exemplos, mas temos exemplos em várias áreas, que não necessariamente só no emprego.
Okay, so they're training youth in technology subjects, and if 50% of them get employed within 1 year after the training, then there's a 10% bonus that's paid, something to that effect. Is that?
No. Well, if they got a job, sorry, back to Portuguese. I'm always forgetting. Se eles conseguirem emprego 3, 4 meses depois da intervenção, nós reembolsamos o investidor. O investimento que ele fez inicial é que tem um tax relief of 30% no ano em que faz o investimento. Portanto, o investidor, quando investe, tem um tax relief. Depois é reembolsado pelo seu investimento, mas já não é mais remunerado. Portanto, o tax relief é garantido independentemente de atingir ou não o resultado. É esse o incentivo.
So, Gianluca, to understand sort of the concerns that you're raising about impact bonds, I don't know if this example helps as an illustration or not. Maybe it'd be good to just clarify where you're coming from.
Well, more generally speaking, I'm not concerned by the specific instrument, but by the approach of impact investing because of the difficulties in measuring social impact. What we see right now in the debate at the European Commission about the taxonomy says a lot. Says that we can approach the measurement of environmental sustainability in quite an easy way, because there is a strong development of objective indicators based on science. But when we talk about social impact, there is no consensus by experts, by practitioners, by policymakers on the indicators that should lead us in the evaluation of social impact. So this translated into the financial instruments of impact investing, including the social impact bond, of course, creates a tension, the tension between the attitude of investors to choose for easy projects. So projects that are more easy to evaluate, and all other projects that in many cases are more innovative. I'm convinced that investors are not really keen to be innovative. Investors are usually very conservative, except for those investors that can have a very high return on the investment. But this is not the case of investing in social sector. So you see, there is a kind of a contradiction. On one side, what we want is to mobilize private resources, because as Filipe correctly said, public resources are not enough in order to support the development of this sector and the answer to the new social needs that we see as a priority for the next future. So on one side, we need private money. On the other side, the kind of private money that we need should be a patient money, a patient capital. But unfortunately, this is an exception, because right now, most of the instruments based on the impact, social impact factor, are not decoupled from the need of the investor to have their investments repaid as quickly as possible. I'm sitting in the board of one of the four main social impact funds in Italy. And in my experience, every week when we have to decide our investments is that we are obliged by the nature of the instrument, so by the nature of the fund, we are obliged to choose projects that are not innovative, that are quite conservative, that are returning the investment in a guaranteed way. And I don't think this is the kind of finance that the development of social and solidarity economy needs. So that's my point.
Great. Thank you, Giancarlo. Mr. Park, I'm going to bring you back in now and see if you can also help to respond to some of Gianluca's concerns in terms of the innovations that are taking place. The social enterprises that your SVS is funding, what sectors are they operating in, and how are they doing things that are different than traditional enterprises? The innovations that Gianluca is talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, the SVS is conducting financial support activities for whole range of social and solidarity economic organizations. By the type of SC, social enterprise organizations, certified social enterprise makes up the largest proportion at 35%, followed by social ventures at 31.9%, and cooperatives at 14.4%, etc. And by industry, manufacturing accounts for 21.3%, and social services 19.9%, wholesale and retail 71%, etc. In the case of SVS, in the case of SVS, very interested in measuring and evaluating social impact, but SVS does not adopt a method of measurement to be expressed in specific numbers like social return on investment. SVS analyzed social impact in the investment and loan screening process by dividing contribution to the social economy ecosystem and the contribution to the social finance ecosystem two away. One, the contribution to the social economy ecosystem, which is called the first impact, is divided into what, which means the goals of creating social value, who, which means the specific targets for impact, how much, which means a scale, duration, and extent of the impact, for contribution, which means the development of social economic ecosystem. This method is based on the impact management project IMP technique used by BSC. And in order to review and evaluate the contribution of investment and loans to the social finance ecosystem, which is called second impact, SVS categorized the role of investment and loans into four effects. First, the signal effect generated by encouraging a fundamental change in the awareness of the finance capital markets to consider concepts such as social finance and social values. The second, the engaging effect generated by encouraging impact creation through active intervention, designing financial structures, deciding who to provide investment and loans, etc., in conjunction with the retail social finance intermediate institutions. Third, the growing effect generated by supporting changes and the development of impact markets and retail social finance institutions. And fourth, the flexible capitalization effect generated by designing a flexible supply of finance and providing capital, such as selective subordinate finance, loan loss provision, self-help fund matching, and setting the rates of return for investment and loans that reflect effect. Thank you.
So is that something that is sort of self-reported, that the social enterprises give you their results, or is there an independent party that's doing the evaluation, or do you have your own monitoring team within your organization? How are you measuring those?
That combines the internal staff who has specialized skill for monitoring and evaluation, and the outside counseling group members, two groups working together to review the screening process.
Thank you. Okay, Mohamed, back to Morocco. Can you say a little bit more about the policy environment and how that supported the financing of SSEs? Is there more to it than just that the government said we're going to do it?
Alors, au niveau du Maroc, déjà, nous avons porté notre attention sur trois éléments très importants. Le premier, bien sûr, c'est cette durabilisation de l'impact. La seconde question, c'est aussi, comme je viens de le préciser, cette mesure de l'impact qui est difficulteuse. Mais une des choses qui demeure les plus importantes reste aussi l'idée que l'on doit aussi contextualiser toutes ces problématiques rapportées à notre contexte, bien sûr, est une chose très importante. Alors, l'action de l'INDH a eu, comme je l'ai explicité, un impact sur l'ensemble de l'ESS. On l'a vu avec l'augmentation de l'ensemble des initiatives qui ne pouvaient pas se financer avant, qui aujourd'hui, on a pu créer une dynamique. Vous avez l'initiative d'un côté, puis vous avez le ministère qui est chargé de l'économie sociale, entre autres, de l'autre côté, les foires, etc. Donc, nous avons eu une dynamique un petit peu qui est très importante. Cette dynamique, malheureusement, n'est pas allée dans un sens d'homogénéité. Alors, le tissu associatif, par exemple, si je prends ce tissu-là, il s'est développé pour porter des projets de l'INDH et il est apparu comme étant hétérogène. C'est une raison pour laquelle cette troisième phase a été, si vous voulez, une phase apprenante où on a aujourd'hui suggéré à l'ensemble des partenaires encourager en fait des partenariats externes pour professionnaliser un petit peu le secteur. D'un autre côté, nous avons des initiatives à caractère sectoriel, par exemple pour l'agriculture qui est très importante au Maroc. D'un point de vue du nombre, par exemple, des coopératives, qui est le plus grand, disons, dans ce secteur-là, de celui agricole. Nous avons aussi les produits de terroir qui sont très en vogue dans notre contexte. Nous avons une agence de développement agricole qui va intervenir aussi, donc reprendre un petit peu le travail fait dans le financement et essayer un petit peu d'en étendre l'impact avec plusieurs initiatives. Je prends un exemple très simple, celui par exemple de l'appui aux efforts de labellisation, surtout pour ces produits terroirs, pour qu'ils soient acceptés dans d'autres marchés. D'ailleurs, beaucoup de coopératives dans ce sens-là arrivent à une taille critique où la coopérative devient très connue, où la coopérative grandit, où elle commence à même exporter ses produits. Ça, c'est pour un... Nous avons aussi un office de développement et de coopération qui aussi travaille en concertation avec les autres protagonistes de cet écosystème et dont finalement le but c'est de nous fournir en données statistiques, même si ces données ne sont pas toujours à jour malheureusement, font qu'aujourd'hui on s'appuie d'une manière plus spécifique où on appuie d'une manière plus spécifique ces coopératives-là. J'ai dit tout à l'heure qu'elles étaient importantes, notamment pour l'insertion par le travail, et en apportant, ces appuis se font par des apports en diagnostic, en appui, on aide à la commercialisation. Encore une fois, des foires, on essaie d'organiser un petit peu des foires pour écouler les biens et services de l'ensemble de ces coopératives. Donc, somme toute, nous essayons de mettre en œuvre un écosystème où les uns financent, où le partenariat est possible, où le financement du type microcrédit est aussi possible et facilité, où aujourd'hui on essaie d'intégrer aussi les banques et d'autre part on essaie aussi d'avoir des instances qui vont aider à la commercialisation, aider au développement de ces instances. Et vous l'avez vu, c'est-à-dire que tout cela, c'est dans notre contexte où la majorité des associations, la majorité de ces coopératives-là, il faut le dire, il le précisait, se situent dans des zones parfois enclavées où l'initiative, encore une fois, a essayé de désenclaver, a essayé de fournir en prestations, en routes, etc. Donc, c'est tout un écosystème pour faire en sorte que cet impact soit inscrit, comme je l'ai dit, dans une durabilité et où, là où malheureusement la mesure de l'impact n'est pas une chose aisée, n'est pas une chose facile finalement. Je vous remercie.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I would love it if each of the panelists could identify, one final thing that they would like to see, something that's still missing from their environment that they would like to add into their environment. And so, Mohamed, maybe I'll start with you. And Filipe, if you could just look in the Q&A, there's a question for you that somebody's interested in hearing. So if you could answer that when your turn comes around. Mohamed, go ahead. What's missing? What do you want to have happen next? So, sorry, Mohamed, maybe it got lost in translation. That question was for you.
It's for Mohamed, right?
Yeah.
Excusez-moi, est-ce que la question m'était adressée?
So, yeah, the questions for all panelists, and I was going to start with you. And then the question is, what's missing? What do you want to have happen next in Morocco?
Alors le Maroc devrait en effet dédier, somme toute, et avec tout ce qu'on a dit et tout ce que tous les panélistes aujourd'hui nous ont apporté, je pense que le Maroc devrait dédier des mécanismes de financement propres à son secteur de l'ESS. Et ceci dans une logique de continuité, mais aussi d'écosystème. Je pense que nous devons aussi asseoir un système d'accompagnement professionnel et ce de la création au post-création, c'est-à-dire de la création vers l'accompagnement finalement de ces entreprises. Et je pense aussi que des mécanismes innovants tels que le crowdfunding, par exemple, qui est récent dans notre pays, devrait aussi profiter à ces organismes de l'ESS afin d'accompagner la mouvance du secteur et de lui permettre de s'épandre et de se développer sans différence entre les entreprises classiques.
Okay.
Alors aujourd'hui, si le retour pécuniaire sur investissement est important, je reste aussi persuadé que le retour social l'est tout autant, car social et économique devraient en aucun cas être séparés, comme nous l'a martelé chaque jour, comme nous le martèle chaque jour la crise pandémique, par exemple.
Thank you. Mr. Park, what about for you? What's missing from the Korean landscape that you want to see happen next?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing is to get more citizens participate in the social finance in order to increase citizens' participation in social finance, that is citizens' social investment. It is necessary to actively consider the following. First, leaders and activists in the SSC area need to work with civil society in actively promoting the establishment of social banks. If such an attempt is made in earnest, policymakers need to respond with improvements in the legal system, such as easing the requirements for establishing banks. Second, it is also necessary to raise joint funds between labor unions and SSC organizations. It is means cooperation between labor and the social solidarity economies, but it can also serve as a shortcut to drastically expand civil-based funds in the near future with the help of organized workers. Lastly, revising tax laws to increase the funding of charitable investors and citizen investors to SSC organizations is also necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. And Filipe, the final word is yours.
Thank you very much. Em relação à pergunta que fizeram no chat sobre a bolsa, sorry, I have the translation. I have to. Sorry, I'm sorry. Em relação à pergunta que fizeram no chat sobre a bolsa de valores sociais, ela não está ativa em Portugal. Não acompanhei de perto o processo, mas presumo que tenha sido inativada por falta de continuidade do investimento privado que a suportava, pese embora fosse uma excelente ideia. Em relação ao que falta em Portugal, neste momento estamos numa fase de transição entre períodos de programação, a negociar o próximo pacote de financiamento para 7 anos com a Comissão Europeia, e o que estamos a fazer é, com a aprendizagem do que aconteceu nos últimos 5, 6 anos em Portugal, a desenhar novos instrumentos que permitam evoluir para além do que foram estes que vos apresentei. O que é que eu acho que eles devem fazer? Devem aprofundar algumas coisas. Primeiro, conseguir ajustar os modelos de financiamento às necessidades das organizações, e isso significa simplificar o modelo de financiamento, e é possível fazê-lo com as regras europeias, porque o que acontece com o financiamento europeu é que pode ser com certeza uma boa forma de catalisar, mobilizar o ecossistema, mas provoca invariavelmente um fardo administrativo muito significativo sobre organizações de economia social que não têm capacidade nem experiência para responder a essa exigência. Então, simplificar o modelo de financiamento é uma prioridade. Por outro lado, ajustá-lo de forma a atrair mais investimento privado através dessa simplificação, da clarificação, da medição de resultados, nomeadamente o que já estamos a fazer em Portugal, que é fixar o valor dos resultados com base na poupança de despesa pública, que é um indicador aproximado e objetivo, não do impacto, mas é uma forma de mensurar o impacto que se provoca, uma vez que estamos a usar fundos públicos e temos que colocar um valor nos resultados. E, por fim, é fundamental aprofundar a ligação destes projetos experimentais, desta inovação social, às políticas públicas. Esse match ainda não foi inteiramente conseguido, ainda não há um canal óbvio, e é fundamental fazer a ligação entre estes projetos e a política pública. A final note, A Comissão Europeia, o ano passado, lançou um concurso para consórcios de Estados-membros se organizarem no sentido de, nos próximos 2 anos, criarem estruturas nacionais a que chamam Centros Nacionais de Competências para a Inovação Social. Atualmente foram aprovados 6 consórcios, que reúnem 24 dos 27 Estados-membros e ainda o Reino Unido, que estão ativamente a trabalhar para criar estruturas muito semelhantes àquelas à Portugal Inovação Social, em termos do mandato para a dinamização dos ecossistemas. Portanto, o passo que falta, e que nos faltava a nós em Portugal, é termos parceiros na Europa com quem conversar, porque a partilha destas boas práticas e a possibilidade destas boas ideias escalarem para diferentes territórios, ajustadas às características de cada território, é fundamental. E o que faltava era ter esses parceiros europeus. E é isso que está a acontecer nestes próximos 2 anos, portanto, é para lá que nos encaminhamos. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. No, thanks to all the panelists and to Gianluca as well. Very exciting session, very interesting to see the different approaches in different countries, some more top-down, some more bottom-up. It sounds like everybody's grappling with this issue of social measurement. And there's no magic fix to that. So that's one area that definitely requires more attention. I kept hearing ecosystem, like we need the right ecosystem, getting all the different players together, working on these things collaboratively. And it's true, this is a group effort. It's not something that individual companies can do on their own. You know, where the government and the private sector are working together, there's certainly more opportunities. And I think the examples from Morocco and Korea and Portugal illustrate that quite clearly. So Juliana, I'm sorry that we've run over, but I think it was a very interesting session, and thanks for giving us a chance to share the experiences.
Obrigada a você, Craig, pela excelente moderação e aos nossos panelistas pela discussão muito interessante e intensa, inclusive os participantes que participaram muito no chat e nas perguntas. Não há problema que avançamos o tempo. Se pudéssemos, estaríamos aqui por muito mais tempo, pois é um tema que podemos expandir muito. Então, obrigado a todos pela participação. Antes de os deixar ir para a pausa, gostaria só de dar 2 avisos rápidos. O primeiro é que na quinta-feira, como eu disse no começo, vamos ter o Marketplace novamente. Aqueles que não puderam expor na sexta-feira, no Marketplace, terão os temas mantidos, então poderão voltar ali para expor. E se alguém quer trazer novos temas, por favor, envie um e-mail para socialeconomy@itc-ilo.org para que nós possamos verificar se é possível adicionar esses novos temas e como fazer, tá bom? Então, aqueles que já tinham adicionado temas que iam falar na semana passada já estão confirmados. Os que queiram adicionar novos, enviam um e-mail para que a gente possa conversar sobre isso. Isso dito, o segundo aviso é que daqui a pouco nos vemos nas eletivas. As eletivas dessa semana começam hoje na segunda-feira, 3h30 horário da Itália, né? É o mesmo horário das eletivas da semana passada, mas começam hoje. Então, espero vocês daqui a pouco para as eletivas de novo. Temos as eletivas 5, 6, 7, 8. Caso tenha alguma dúvida, de novo, nos comuniquem. E nos vemos muito em breve. Obrigada a todos pela participação nessa plenária. Até logo.